some secrets are not lies. They are shelters. A woman will bury her own name, drown her own history, and teach her heart to beat quietly in the dark, all to keep one precious thing alive. For 6 years, she had done exactly that, in a village at the edge of the sea, where no living soul knew who she truly was. Then, on a storm-black evening, with the rain driving off the water, a duke who was never meant to find her climbed the cliff road and knocked at her door. And when she opened it, he did the one thing she had never prepared herself to survive. The village was called Carrick Cove, a scatter of slate cottages clinging to the cliffs where the land gave up and the gray Atlantic took over. Here, the widow Locke had built a life so small and so ordinary that no one ever looked at it twice. She mended nets for the fishermen and kept their figures straight in a ledger they could not read for themselves, and in return, they left mackerel on her step and asked her nothing. That was the bargain of the cove, and she kept it faithfully. She rose before the gulls each morning. She lit the fire, she cut the bread thin, and she watched 2 dark heads sleeping in the narrow bed against the wall. Perrin and Jory, 6 years old, salt in their hair, and entirely, fiercely hers. They believed their father had been a sailor lost to the sea, and she had never corrected them, because the truth was far more dangerous than any drowning. The widow Locke was not a widow. She had never in her life been called Locke. And though 6 long winters had passed since she came to the cove with 2 infants, and everything she owned knotted into a single shawl, she still went to the window every single evening and watched the cliff road for anyone who did not belong. To understand why a woman would drown her own name, you must go back 7 years, to a shipyard in Falmouth, and a girl who smelled of pine resin and sea varnish. Her name then was Cara Trewin, the only daughter of a chart maker who could draw the coastline of half the county from memory. She was no lady. She had no dowry, no title, no family of consequence, only a quick mind, a steady hand, and the unforgivable habit of speaking to men as though she were their equal. Then a frigate limped into the yard for repair, her hull torn open by a French gun, and her captain came ashore to argue about the cost of the timber. His name was Leander Dacre. He was the second son of a great house, a man who had gone to sea precisely so he would never have to lean on that house for anything. He argued with her father for an hour. He argued with Cara for 3. And in the long, slow months, the wounded ship sat in dock. Between the arguing and the mending, the 2 of them fell into something neither had planned, and neither could stop. They married in secret. They both knew what the world would say about the grandson of a duke and the daughter of a shipwright, and so they told no one. And for a little while they were happy in the reckless, foolish way of people who believe the future will forgive them anything. Then 2 things happened, almost in the same breath. Leander's elder brother died with no son to follow him, and Leander's frigate was ordered back to sea. He sailed away a captain. He sailed away not knowing his wife was already carrying his children. And while he was gone, the great house discovered what he had done. Cara was summoned, not by Leander, who was 1,000 miles away across black water, but by his cousin, a soft-spoken man named Aldous Dacre, who until that summer had expected to inherit everything, and who now found a nameless girl standing squarely between himself and one of the oldest dukedoms in the west of England. Aldous was gentle with her. Aldous was patient, and in the mild, pleasant voice of a man remarking on the weather, he made her understand how precarious the position of a nameless young woman could become when she stood between a powerful man and everything he wanted, and how easily such a woman, and all that she held dear, might slip quietly out of the world and be forgotten. It would grieve him, he said, to see her come to any misfortune. She was not a fool. She had grown up watching the sea swallow men who thought they knew better. She knew a threat when it smiled at her. So when word finally came that Captain Dacre's ship had gone down with all hands off the coast of Spain, and that she was now the widow of a marriage no one would ever acknowledge, with 2 heirs whose very existence placed them in terrible danger, Kara did the only thing left to her. She let Kara Trewin die. She stitched a false grief onto a false name, took a coach as far as her coins would carry her, and vanished into the one place a duke's family would never lower themselves to look. A fishing village at the last frayed thread of the country. For 6 years it had held. For 6 years the boys had grown brown and loud and unafraid, and no one had ever come. What she did not permit herself to think about on the long nights when the wind screamed in off the water was the simple arithmetic of it. With Leander in his grave, only 2 small boys asleep in a borrowed bed now stood between Aldous Dacre and everything he had ever wanted. And a man willing to menace a defenseless young mother to clear his own path to a fortune was not a man who would surrender merely because he could not find her. Secrets, though, keep a tide of their own, and on the night this story truly begins, that tide was already rising, climbing the cliff road in the dark, in the shape of a rider none of them had any reason to expect. The storm came in from the west a little after nightfall, the way the bad ones always did, announcing itself first as a green bruise on the horizon, and then as a wall of rain that turned the whole cove to smoke. Kara had lived long enough beside the water to read its moods. She barred the shutters, banked the fire, and set the kettle where the heat would keep it warm through the night. Perrin and Jory had fought sleep the way they always did, demanding one more story, one more account of the giant crab that lived beneath Carrick Rock and stole the boots of careless children. She had given it to them twice. Now they slept tangled together like 2 halves of the same creature. Jory's fist knotted in his brother's nightshirt, Perrin's mouth open against the pillow. For a moment she stood over them, and something in her chest ached with a happiness so fierce it frightened her. This was the whole of her fortune. 2 sleeping boys and a fire that did not smoke. She had built it out of nothing at all, and she guarded it the way a dragon guards its hoard. That was when the knock came. It was wrong the instant she heard it. The people of Carrick Cove did not knock after dark. A neighbor in trouble would call her name through the door. A drunk would hammer and shout for all the world to hear. This was 3 slow, heavy, deliberate blows against the oak, the knock of a man who had come a very long way and fully intended to be let in. Kara went utterly still. The kettle ticked, the rain roared, and 6 years of quiet dread folded away and pressed down and told each night to be silent, rose up in her all at once. She had always known, in the deepest and most honest part of herself, that a night such as this one would come. You could not carry a secret as heavy as hers forever. You could only choose each morning to carry it one day longer. 6 years of ordinary mornings had made her careless enough to be happy. And happiness, she had learned as a girl, was only the sound a trap makes in the moment before it closes. She had rehearsed this. God help her. She had rehearsed it 100 times in the dark. There was a bag beneath the bed, with dry clothes for the boys and every coin she had saved. There was a path down the cliff to the shingle that no stranger would ever find in the black. There was a story ready on her tongue, worn smooth with use, that she was a widow and only a widow, that no one called Kara Trewin had ever lived beneath this roof. For one wild moment she nearly did it. She nearly abandoned the fire and the kettle and the whole small, warm life of the place, nearly dragged the boys stumbling from their bed, and fled down the black cliff into the teeth of the storm. But the storm was a surer danger to 2 small children than any stranger at the door could ever be. And a man at the door was not yet a man through it. So she made herself breathe, and she made herself think, and she did the harder thing, which was to stay. She took the iron poker from beside the hearth and held it low against her skirts. "Go on your way," she called. Her voice did not shake, which she counted as a small mercy. "We want nothing here tonight." There was a pause. Then a voice came through the door, roughened by weather and by something underneath the weather that she could not name. "Please," it said, "I have come a very long way. I only want to look at you." The words made no sense to her at all. She ran quickly through the short list of men who might stand at her door in a storm. A shipwrecked sailor would beg for a fire and a corner, not for the sight of her face. An excise officer hunting smugglers along the coast would announce himself and demand to be let in. Aldous Dacre, or the men that Aldous paid, would lie sweetly and speak of her welfare and her safety. Not one of them would say that strange, quiet, impossible thing. "I only want to look at you." It was the sort of thing a man said standing at a grave. She crept to the window, lifted one corner of the shutter a finger's width, and put her eye to the gap. A single horse stood in the streaming dark, its head hung low with a bone-deep exhaustion. And on her step, hatless, soaked entirely through, one hand braced against the doorframe as though he could not remain upright without it, stood a large man she could not yet make out. The lamp behind her threw her own shadow across him. She shifted her weight, and the light slid past her and fell full upon his face. Kara stopped breathing. She knew that face. She had traced the line of it with her fingers in a Falmouth shipyard 7 years before. She saw it every single day of her life, in the stubborn set of Perrin's jaw and in the gray of Jory's eyes. It was a face she had wept over and mourned and finally buried in the only grave she had been able to give it, which was silence. It was the face of a man who had been dead for 6 years. For a long moment, Kara did not move. The poker hung forgotten at the end of her arm, the careful part of her mind, the part that kept the fisherman's ledgers and counted the mackerel and had trained itself never, ever to hope, informed her in a calm and reasonable voice that she was looking at a ghost, or at her own madness, or at nothing more than a cruel trick of lamplight and storm. Because Leander Dacre was drowned. She had that truth from 3 separate men. His ship had gone down off the coast of Spain with every soul aboard. There had been no survivors, not one. She had grieved him until the grief hardened into a stone she carried everywhere and had long ago stopped noticing. And yet the stone was standing on her doorstep in the rain. "Open the door, Kara," she told herself, and did not. Her hand found the bolt and froze there, trembling against the cold iron. If she opened it, one of 2 things must be true. Either the sea had given her husband back to her 6 years too late to do any good, or something that merely wore his face had come at last for her boys. She could not have said which of the 2 frightened her the more. A ghost could be sent away with prayers and a hard heart. A living man who had lost everything he owned to Aldous Dacre could not be sent anywhere at all, and would not wish to be. She drew the bolt. She opened the door the width of a hand, the chain still drawn taut across the gap, the poker lifted and ready. Close to he was worse, and he was unmistakable. The years had used him hard. There was gray at his temples now that had not been there before, and a lean, scoured hardness to him, as though the sea had boiled away everything soft and left only the frame behind. He held his weight off one leg, favoring it, as though an old wound there had set badly and never wholly mended. A thin scar tugged at the corner of his mouth, and his right hand, when the light caught it, was ruined. The fingers curled and stiff, 2 of them gone below the knuckle, a maimed and clumsy thing that he kept pressed to his chest, as though it pained him still. His eyes found hers through the narrow gap. Whatever she had braced herself against, it was not the thing she saw looking back at her. not triumph, not the cold and careful arithmetic of Aldous. Only a vast and drowning relief, the look of a man who has walked toward a single lit window for years, across an ocean of dark, and has finally, impossibly, reached its glass. "You are alive," he said, and his voice broke clean in half on the word. "They told me you were dead. They told me you died with the child, and I believed them. God forgive me, I believed them for 6 years." "I do not know you," Kara said. It was the drilled lie, the one that had kept her sons breathing for 6 years, and it came out of her now by pure reflex. "My name is Locke. You have the wrong house and the wrong woman." He flinched as though she had laid the poker across his face, but he did not argue, and he did not throw his weight against the door as she had half expected. Instead, slowly, wincing, cradling the ruined hand, he lowered himself down onto his knees on the wet stone of her step. He reached into the sodden bag slung at his side, and he drew out 2 small objects and set them down, carefully, side by side, in the mud where the lamplight could reach them. 2 boats, 2 little sailing boats no longer than a man's hand, carved from pale, close-grained wood, each small mast rigged with waxed thread, each hull rubbed smooth and dark as though it had been turned over and over by anxious fingers for a very long time. One of the little sails had been mended where the thread had frayed, mended and mended again. The patient work of a man with a great deal of time on his hands, and only one of them left whole to do it. Not 1 boat. 2. Kara looked down at them, and the drilled lie withered in her throat. For 6 years she had been so careful. She had told no living soul. There was no record anywhere in the world that Kara Trewin had borne 2 sons, and not 1. Even the family's own tidy lie had spoken of a single lost child. And yet, here knelt a dead man in the rain, offering 2 boats to 2 boys he had never once laid eyes on, as though he had known all along precisely how many of them lay sleeping behind her door. Someone had told him, someone who knew the one thing that no one in all the world was supposed to know. And if that someone knew there were 2 boys and knew to send a drowned man west to find them, then the wall she had spent 6 years raising stone by stone around her children had a crack running through it that she had never seen. "I will not come in unless you allow it," Leander said quietly, the rain sheeting off his jaw. "I will not touch them. I have no right to. But I could not stay away, not once I knew they were in the world." The rain filled the 2 little boats and spilled over their sides, and for the first time in 6 long years, Kara Trewin had no plan at all. She should not have let him in. Every rule she had made for herself across 6 years said precisely the same thing. You do not open the door, you do not listen. You take the boys down the cliff path, and you do not look back. But he was on his knees in the rain, and he was her husband, and the 2 little boats were filling with water at his feet, and some part of Kara that she had buried long ago, along with her name, clawed its way up to the surface, and made the decision before her reason could stop it. "Get up," she said roughly. "You will wake the whole cove, and half of them owe me money. Get up and come inside before you die a second time on my step, and I have to explain the body." He came in slowly, ducking beneath the low lintel, and in the small, bright room he seemed enormous, a creature of open water folded into a cottage built for smaller lives. Water ran from him and pooled on the flags. He did not sit. He stood just inside the door with the ruined hand held to his chest and looked at everything: the mended nets, the thin loaves, the 2 pairs of small boots drying by the hearth, as though he were reading the whole long story of her exile in a single glance. Kara kept the table between them and the poker within her reach. She did not offer him the fire. She was not ready to be kind, not until she understood what stood in her house. "How are you alive?" she said. "I had it from 3 men that your ship went down with every soul aboard her." "She did go down," he said. He looked at his hand. "Most of them drowned. I did not, though I have spent a great many nights since wishing I had. Some Spanish fishermen pulled 4 of us off a broken spar. The French took what the sea had left. I spent 3 years in a prison at Verdun, and 2 more after that, finding my way home across a war. And when I finally walked back into my grandfather's house, I found my grandfather dead, my brother dead, myself the Duke of Ravensmore, and my wife dead in childbed with our baby, while I rotted in a cell." The word baby, spoken as one and not as 2, landed in the little room like a dropped plate. "They told you the baby died," Kara said slowly. "They told me you both died," Leander said. "Kara Trewin, unmarried in the eyes of the world, buried in a pauper's plot with the infant she was said to have died bearing. My cousin Aldous was very gentle when he told me. He walked me to the churchyard himself. He showed me the parish register. He had even paid for a small stone." Kara sat down. Her legs had simply ceased to hold her weight. For 6 years, she had believed one clean and simple thing, that her husband was dead, and his family were her enemies. She had never let herself imagine the other shape the truth might take, that the very same lie had been carried to him from the other side, that while she wept for him here, he had stood at a false grave with her name cut into the stone, and wept for her. "You believed him," she said, and it came out more bitterly than she had meant it. "You believed I was dead, and you never came to look." "I believed the man who walked me to my wife's grave," Leander said, very low. "Was I a fool? I was. I was a broken, half-starved fool who had lost 5 years of my life to that war and wanted nothing on earth but to lie down and stop. Aldous handed me my grief already wrapped and tied, and I took it from him, because taking it was easier than hoping. And I will carry that cowardice to my own grave." He looked at her, and the shame in his face was a hard thing to witness. "But 3 weeks ago, a woman who had served my grandmother her whole life lay dying, and could not go to God with the weight of it on her soul. She told me she had put a girl and 2 newborn boys onto a westbound coach 6 years ago with her own hands, and that the girl's name had been Kara. 2, Kara whispered. 2, he agreed. "That is how I knew. That is the only reason in the world I knew." The silence between them filled slowly with the sound of the rain. Then he did the thing she had not braced herself for. Not the shouting she had feared as a girl, not the cold seizing of the children she had dreaded every night as a mother. He turned instead toward the shut door of the room where the boys slept, and he did not go through it. He stopped a pace short of the threshold, as though a line had been drawn across the floor that he had no right to cross. "May I look at them?" he asked. "Only look. You may stand between us the entire time with your poker if it eases your mind. But I have carved 2 boats every winter for 6 years, for children I believed were bones in the cold ground, and I find that I cannot walk out of this house again without knowing their faces." And Kara, who had spent 6 hard years teaching herself to trust no living soul, looked at this ruined, dripping, dispossessed man standing in her cottage, asking permission to look upon his own sons, a man who by every law in England might simply have taken them and dared her to prevent it, and felt the whole careful architecture of her hatred begin to come apart in her hands. She opened the door. He did not step through it. He stood upon the threshold with the ruined hand pressed flat over his mouth, and he looked at Perrin and Jory tangled together in the narrow bed, and his great shoulders began to shake, and he wept without making a single sound, the way a man learns to weep in a place where any noise at all is punished. Kara stood beside him in the doorway. She had cast this man as a monster for so many years that she did not know where to put the truth of him. And as she watched her husband come silently apart at the sight of the two children he had been told were dead, one cold and perfectly clear thought cut through everything else inside her. If Aldous Dacre had lied to a duke's own face and had paid good money for a false gravestone to keep these boys from ever being found, then Leander alive did not make her sons any safer at all. It made them the two most dangerous children in England. For a long while neither of them spoke. The fire had burned down to a red heart in the grate, and the rain had settled into the patient, steady drumming of a storm that meant to keep them company all night. Leander had come away from the boys' door at last, and Kara, against every instinct she owned, had let him take the second chair beside the fire. A man could not sit and plot the safety of children while he shivered, and the sight of him breaking silently at the sight of his sons had undone something in her that 6 years of careful hatred had never prepared her to feel. She poured 2 cups of the bitter tea she kept for the fisherman and set one down in front of him without a word. He took it in his left hand. The ruined right stayed curled in his lap like a dead bird. "Tell me what you have come here to do," she said, "and don't dress it up in kindness. I have had 6 years of men who dressed cruelty in kindness. Tell me plainly, and I will decide whether to believe you." So he told her plainly. He was the Duke of Ravensmoor now. There was no doubt of it and no undoing it. His grandfather and his brother were both in the ground, and the title and the lands and the whole crushing weight of the house had fallen upon the one man everyone believed drowned. He had come back from the dead to inherit it. And the very moment he had done so, he had unmade his cousin without lifting a finger. For if Leander lived, then Aldous was not the heir. And if Leander's marriage to a shipwright's daughter had been lawful, and Kara was as certain of that as she was of her own name, then the 2 boys asleep in the next room were not base-born children hidden away in a fishing village. They were the legitimate sons of a duke. They were the whole future of the house. And they stood exactly where Aldous had spent 6 years, and a great deal of forged ink, making certain that no one stood at all. "He did not merely lie to me," Leander said, staring into the fire. "A lie is a thing a frightened man tells. What Aldous did took patience. He entered a false death in a parish register, which is forgery. He raised a stone over an empty grave. He arranged for 3 separate men to carry me the same story, so it would stand up to my grief. He built a whole cathedral of falsehood, brick by brick, and he did it calmly, over years, so that a dead heir and 2 dead infants would clear his road to a dukedom." He turned the cup slowly in his good hand. "A man does not do all of that, and then simply walk away when the truth begins to surface. He doubles it." Kara felt the cold slide down her spine that she had learned to trust more than any comfort. "You were telling me he knows you are alive," she said. "He has known for 3 weeks, since the old woman died, and I began asking questions. Questions a grieving widower had no business asking. I was not careful. I did not think I needed to be." His jaw tightened. "I left Ravensmoor 11 days ago to come and find you. I was not the only one who left. A man in Aldous' pay rode out of the same county the following morning, asking after a widow and 2 boys in every coaching inn along the western road. I have kept ahead of him, but only just, and not for long." The fire popped. In the next room, one of the boys murmured in his sleep and went quiet again. "So, the wall has more than a crack in it," Kara said softly. "The wall is already coming down." "Yes." She stood and went to the window, though there was nothing to see but her own reflection and the black glass streaming with rain. For 6 years, her entire strategy had been a single word: Hide. Stay small. Stay silent. Stay invisible. And the great house would never lower its eyes far enough to find a fishwife and her children at the ragged end of the country. It had been a good plan. It had kept her boys alive. And it had just failed, because a dying woman's conscience had put a name and a direction into the hands of the one man on earth who loved these children as fiercely as she did, and, by the same stroke, into the reach of the one man who needed them dead. Hiding will not save them a second time, she said. It cost her something to say it aloud. It felt like laying down a weapon she had carried so long her hand had grown around the grip. No, Leander agreed. It will not. A hidden heir can quietly vanish, and who is there to ask questions about a fishwife's child at the far end of the country? But a known heir, an heir the whole world has seen and named and bowed to. An heir written into the records in ink no one can burn. That child is armored. Aldous cannot make a boy vanish when the whole of England is watching. It gains him nothing but the rope. You want to make them visible, she said. You want to do the exact opposite of everything I have done to keep them breathing. I want to make them so visible that moving against them becomes the most dangerous thing Aldous Dacre could possibly do. He set the cup down and looked up at her, and there was no softness in his face now. Only the flat, cold planning of the naval officer he had once been. I cannot promise you it is safe. I can only promise you that hiding is no longer safe either. The choice is not between danger and peace, Kara. It has not been that for 11 days. The choice is only which danger we walk into with our eyes open. She looked at this ruined, returned husband of hers, and she understood that he was offering her the one thing no one had offered her in 6 years. Not rescue, not charity, a campaign, a shared enemy and a plan to end him, with the two of them standing on the same side of it. They are my sons, she said, not the future of your house, not heirs, mine. I fed them when I had nothing. I will not hand them to a war they cannot understand and call it their inheritance. Then we do not hand them to anything, Leander said. We fight the war for them, you and I, and we keep them out of the range of the guns until it is won. But I cannot do it from a distance, and I cannot do it as a stranger. I need you to let me stay. I need you to let me stop pretending I am dead. It was the point of no return, and they both knew it. To say yes was to end the Widow Locke forever, to unbury Kara Trewin, to step out of the shadow that had kept her children alive and stand in the full and terrible light. Everything in her screamed to refuse. She thought of the 2 little boats filling with rain. She thought of 6 winters of carving. She thought of a man who had gone down on his knees on her step rather than force a single inch of her door. Stay, Kara said. God help us both. Stay. Leander did not move into the cottage. He took a room above the alehouse from a widow named Jocelyn, who asked no questions of a scarred man with a duke's coin and a sailor's manners. And each morning he walked the cliff path down to the cove as though he had always belonged there. He did not rush the boys. He had lost 5 years of his life to that war, and he had learned, at a bitter cost, that some things could only be waited for and never seized. The first day, Perrin and Jory watched him from behind their mother's skirts, with the frank suspicion of children who had been taught, without ever being told why, that strangers were a kind of weather to be sheltered from. The second day, Leander sat on an upturned barrel at the edge of the quay and began, slowly and clumsily with his one good hand, to whittle a fishhook barb from a sliver of bone. By the third day, Jory, who had never in his short life met a question he could bear to leave unasked, had crept close enough to demand what he was making. Perrin took longer. Perrin was the watchful one. the one who stood a half step behind his brother and studied the world before he trusted his weight to it. And Kara loved him for it, because it was so entirely her own. It was 3 more days before Perrin came near, and when he did, it was to thrust his own carved boat at the tall man in wordless accusation, because the little sail had torn. Leander did not laugh at him, and he did not make a great show of it either. He simply took the boat and turned it over in his ruined hand, and said gravely that it was a fine vessel that had plainly seen hard weather, and that they had better re-rig her properly if she was to be seaworthy again. And he showed the boy how patiently, over the whole of an afternoon, and by the end of it, Perrin had decided, in the absolute way of children, that the tall man was his. By the end of the first week, both boys trailed him about the cove like gulls behind a fishing boat, and Kara watched it happen with a feeling she could not name, something that was neither quite fear nor quite hope, but stood uneasily between the two. He never told them who he was. That had been her one hard condition, and he kept it without complaint. He was simply the tall man who could tie any knot in the world, even the ones that seemed impossible, even with a hand that only half worked. He taught Perrin to splice a rope. He taught Jory the names of the stars a sailor steered by, and in the evenings, he carved, always carved, and Kara pretended not to notice that the 2 little boats, which had sat filling with rain on her doorstep, now sat dry and proud on the mantel, and that the boys had named them and sailed them in the wash bucket and fought over them and loved them. But she had not forgotten why he had come, nor the man riding the western road somewhere behind him. And so she did the thing she had always done when the world frightened her. She went back to her ledgers. The cove sold its catch through a factor named Nance, a heavy, comfortable man from the market town who came twice a month with his cart and his scales and his book, and who bought the whole of Carrot Cove's pilchards and mackerel at a price he alone set. The fishermen could not read his book. They could barely read the weights. They trusted him the way tired men trust anyone who saves them a longer walk, and every fortnight they took his coin and were grateful for it. And every fortnight, Kara had slowly come to suspect they were robbed. She had kept the cove's own tallies for 3 years, quietly in a hand no one but she could read. And on a gray afternoon, while Leander taught her sons to whip the frayed end of a line, she spread 4 seasons of those tallies across her table and set them beside her memory of Nance's book, and she found it. It was not a large theft. That was the whole cleverness of it. Nance had shaved the weight of every barrel by a few pounds, and rounded every price down by a few pennies, and set his scales a hair out of true, and no single fisherman on any single fortnight had lost enough to be worth the quarrel. But the cove had 40 boats, and 40 boats, robbed of a few pounds and a few pennies each, twice in every month for years, came to a sum that made Kara sit back in her chair and go very still. "He owes this cove near 200 pounds, she said aloud, to no one, and then, because Leander had come in out of the wind and was watching her with those pale eyes, she said it again to him. 200 pounds, stolen a farthing at a time from men who cannot count high enough to catch him at it. He has been doing it since before ever I came here." Leander looked at the columns of her figures, at the years of patient, invisible work, at the trap she had sprung with nothing in her hands but arithmetic and attention, and something shifted in his expression that she chose not to examine too closely. "And what will you do?" he asked. "Nothing dramatic," Kara said. "Drama is for people who can afford to lose. I will simply be standing beside the scales on the next market day with my book, and I will read Nance his own figures back to him in front of every man he has cheated." She closed the ledger. Men like Nance have built their whole lives on no one paying attention, so I shall pay attention out loud, where everyone can hear." The next market day was bright and cold, and the whole cove gathered on the quay to sell, and Nance set up his scales and opened his book with the easy confidence of a man who has never once been questioned. Kara stood at his elbow, with her own book open, and when he called out the weight of the first barrel, she called out, clear and pleasant, the true weight beside it, and the difference between them. Nance laughed the first time and told her to run along. He did not laugh the second time. By the fifth barrel, his comfortable face had gone the color of tallow, and the fishermen of Carrick Cove had fallen silent and drawn close, and had begun, slowly, dangerously, to understand what the widow Locke was telling them in her clear, untroubled voice. He repaid the cove before his cart left the quay. He counted the coins out onto an upturned barrel with shaking hands, under 40 pairs of unforgiving eyes, and then he drove his cart up the cliff road and didn't come back, and a new factor came after him, who kept an honest book, in no small part because word travels among factors as quickly as among gulls. That evening, the fishermen left more than mackerel on her step. They left a brace of fowl and a wheel of cheese and a small heap of the fierce, unspoken gratitude of men who did not have the words for it. And Kara understood, watching Leander lift a shrieking, delighted Jory onto his shoulders in the last of the light, that she had spent 6 years believing she was hidden in this cove, when the truth was gentler and far stronger than that. She was not hidden here. She was held. It was that same night, as she banked the fire, that young Perrin said the thing that turned her blood to seawater. "Mama," he said, sleepy and careless, swinging his little boat by its mast. The man at the inn asked Ferdy today whether the widow Locke had 1 boy or 2. Ferdy said he couldn't rightly remember. Perrin yawned enormously. "That's silly, isn't it? Ferdy's known us our whole lives." Kara kept her hands very still upon the cold ashes. "What man at the inn, my love?" she said, in a voice she was quietly proud of. "The new one, in the gray coat." Perrin was already half into sleep. "He has a soft voice. He gave Ferdy a penny." A man in a gray coat. A soft voice. A penny paid for a child's careless answer. Not a fisherman, not a factor, not anyone the cove had ever laid eyes on before. Kara sat back on her heels in the firelight, and every hair on her arms rose, because she knew, with the flat, cold certainty of a woman who had waited 6 years for exactly this, that the man riding the western road had stopped his riding. He had arrived. His name, she learned by the following noon, was Crail. He had taken the last room the alehouse had, the one up under the eaves, and he had paid for a fortnight in advance, which no honest traveler ever did in a place with nothing whatever to see. He did not fish. He did not trade. He walked the cove with his hands folded behind his gray coat, and his soft voice raised in gentle, friendly questions, and he bought a great many small kindnesses with a great many small coins. He was, Kara thought, watching him from behind her window, a very good hunter. He did not chase. He simply stood still out in the open and let the frightened thing come to him. "Let me deal with him," Leander said that first night, low and hard, when the boys were abed. "I have dealt with harder men than a paid inquiry agent. I could have him off the coast by morning." "And prove to Aldous in a single stroke that there is something here worth guarding," Kara said. "No. A wool buyer from Devon does not throw a stranger off a cliff. A frightened woman with something to hide does. The moment you touch him, you tell him everything. We do not fight this man. We bore him. We show him a dull little fishing village with nothing in it, over and over, until his master's patience or his master's money runs out." She looked at Leander steadily. I have been playing dead for 6 years, Your Grace. Trust me a little longer in the one thing I am better at than you." So she did the only thing she could do. She went to the cove. There was no meeting, no speech. That was not how Carrick Cove worked. She simply walked down to the quay in the gray of the morning and sat mending a net beside old Ferdy, and she said quietly, without ever lifting her eyes from her hands, "There is a man asking after me and my boys. He is not a friend. If he learns the truth of us, I will lose my sons forever. I am telling you this plainly because you have known me 6 years, and I will not insult you with a lie." Ferdy did not stop his own work. His seamed old face did not so much as flicker. After a long while, he said, "What truth would that be then, Mrs.? I don't know any truth about you. You're the Widow Locke. You keep our figures, and you mend our nets, and you got Nance to pay back what he stole off us." He tied off a knot with his thick old fingers. "That's the whole of what I know. That's the whole of what any soul in this cove knows. You can tell your man in the gray coat that Ferdy said so, and Ferdy will say it to his face and all." And that was the bargain of the cove, spoken as plainly as it was ever going to be spoken between them. By the end of that day, Kara understood that Crail had walked into a village which had quietly, without a single word passing between one household and the next, closed over her like water over a dropped stone. He asked, and was met everywhere with a weathered, friendly, impenetrable stupidity. He offered coins, and the coins were taken with thanks, and nothing true was ever given back for them. He asked Ferdy whether the widow had 1 boy or 2, and Ferdy scratched his head and reckoned the widow had a boy, or it might be a niece, he couldn't rightly say, his memory not being what it was since the fever took him 2 winters back. He asked the alewife Jocelyn about her other lodger, the tall, scarred gentleman, and Jocelyn told him the gentleman was a wool buyer out of Devon, who kept to himself and paid on the nail, which was a good deal more than she could say for some she could name, and she looked at Crail's fortnight of unpaid credit while she said it. He asked the children's schoolmistress, and she counted him a roomful of children, none of whom, it seemed, belonged to any widow at all. He asked the curate, and the curate spoke to him at great and holy length about the parish drains, until Crail's eyes glazed, and he made his escape. For 3 days it held. For 3 days the whole cove lied for her with the seamless, unbreakable solidarity of people who had decided, without ever being asked, that she was theirs to protect. And Kara dared, for the first time in a long while, to let herself hope. Then, on the 4th day, the hunter changed his ground. He had learned that the grown folk of Carrick Cove would tell him nothing true, and so he stopped asking the grown folk, and he began, softly and with pennies, to ask the children, who did not yet know how to lie, and did not know that they should. Kara came around the corner of the net loft with a basket on her hip, and her heart stopped dead in her chest. There, at the very edge of the quay, was the man in the gray coat, crouched down low to the height of a child, with a soft and patient smile upon his soft and patient face. And there, standing square in front of him, holding up his little carved boat with its bright mended sail for the stranger to admire, was Jory. "That is a very fine boat indeed," Crail was saying, in a voice as gentle as a lullaby. "Did your papa carve it for you? Only I heard your papa was a sailor, lost at sea long ago, poor man. So someone else must have made you such a fine thing. Was it the tall gentleman from the inn, do you think? The wool buyer? Does he carve boats for you, and for your brother? You have a brother, haven't you? A brother just the same as you." And Jory, who was 6 years old, and proud of his boat, and had never once in his short and happy life been given a reason to fear a smiling man with a penny, drew breath to answer him. Kara could not reach him. She was a full 20 yards away across open ground, and to run, to cry out, To let one single flash of a mother's terror show on her face would tell the hunter in an instant everything he had crossed the whole of England to learn. So she did the very hardest thing she had ever done in all her hard life. She kept walking at an ordinary pace, with an ordinary, pleasant, unhurried face, while her whole world balanced upon the tongue of a 6-year-old boy and the drawing of a single breath. She was still 10 yards off when a long shadow fell across the two of them. "There you are, you young scamp." Leander's voice was easy and bored, the mild exasperation of any grown man for any child forever underfoot. He did not so much as glance at the crouching stranger. He reached down and plucked the little boat out of Jory's hands and turned it over with a craftsman's disapproving frown. "This rigging is a disgrace, and after all the trouble I took over it. What did I tell you about leaving her out in the wet? Come and be shown again, before your mother catches sight of it and lays the blame on me, as she does for everything." And he set his good hand flat upon the boy's shoulder and turned him, gently and completely, away from the man in the gray coat, and steered him off along the quay, talking all the while of thread and tar and knots. And Jory, forever delighted by the tall man, forgot the soft-voiced stranger between one step and the next, and went with him gladly. Crail rose slowly up out of his crouch, and for one long, cold moment, as Kara reached her son at last, and drew him hard against her side, with a hand she prayed to God did not tremble, the hunter stood and watched the tall, scarred man walk away up the quay with the child, and the pale gray eyes were not fooled, not for a heartbeat, and the soft face wore a small, private, knowing smile. He turned to Kara, and he touched the brim of his hat to her, as polite and pleasant as a neighbor on a Sunday. "Fine boys, missus," Crail said softly. "A credit to you. The pair of them. Twins, aren't they?" He let the words settle in the salt air between them. "Now there's a rare and a precious thing, twins. A man could travel the length of the kingdom and not chance upon another such pair." And he turned and walked away up the lane toward the inn, unhurried, entirely at his ease, a man who had found the one thing he had been sent to find, and was in no earthly hurry now that he had it. And Kara stood on the quay with both her sons gathered hard against her, and understood, with a calm that frightened her more than any panic could have, that the long years of hiding were over, and whatever came now would have to be met, not fled. Crail left Carrick Cove the next morning on the early coach, and his going was worse than his coming had been, because a hunter only turns for home when he has something in his bag to carry back. "He will be with Aldous in 4 days," Leander said. They stood together at her table after the boys were asleep, the single candle throwing their 2 shadows huge and wavering against the wall. 5, if the roads run foul. And then Aldous will know the whole of it, that his drowned cousin is alive and walking, that the marriage can be proved, that there are not 1 but 2 sons, healthy and witnessed and beloved of an entire village, that will swear to them before any court in the land. He dragged his good hand down his tired face. "Whatever we mean to do, we must be doing it before that carriage comes down the cliff road." "Then we do not waste this night being afraid," Kara said, though she was afraid more deeply than she let him see. "Tell me what we need, and where each piece of it lies, and I will begin the getting of it tonight." They worked late over the one guttering candle, mapping it out, the marriage lines, and the letters, and the witnesses, and the sworn word of a dead woman, the whole fragile architecture upon which 2 small lives now rested. And it was as they worked, close together in the way of conspirators and of old married people, that the wind outside began to rise. She should have marked it far sooner. She had read weather her whole life long. But her mind had been all on writs and witnesses, and the 4 days' start they did not have, and by the time she lifted her head, the storm was already upon them, a true one, a great westerly with teeth in it, flinging the whole gray weight of the sea against the cliffs hard enough to shudder the flags beneath their feet. She rose to bar the shutters, and it was then, in the turning, that her eye fell upon the little bed by the wall and saw that it held only one sleeping boy where it should have held two. Perrin was gone. Afterward, she could never fully account for the minutes that followed, only that they had the airless, roaring, underwater quality of the very worst kind of dream. Jory, shaken awake and weeping, gave it up in broken pieces. Perrin had fretted over his boat, the one his father's hands had made, left down on the shingle that afternoon. He had said he would only slip down and fetch it, and be terribly quick. He had gone out alone into the first teeth of the storm, and he had not come back. Kara was at the door with a lantern before she knew she had crossed the room, and Leander was already ahead of her, out into the screaming dark. She would remember what came next until the last day of her life. Leander Dacre, who had watched the sea drown his crew within arm's reach, who had felt it crush the living fingers from his hand, who had lost 5 whole years of his life into its cold and lightless keeping. Leander, who could not so much as stand at the edge of deep water without his breath drawing short, took the lantern from her hand at the head of the cliff path and said, over the wind, "The shingle, you stay high, and hold the light where I can see it, whatever happens." And then he went down into the black and the surf and the flying spray, toward the one thing on all the earth that still had the power to unman him, because somewhere down there in it was her son. She held the light. It was the hardest thing anyone had ever asked of her, to stand fast at the top of the path and hold a lantern steady in the gale, while the two halves of her heart, the boy and the man both, were down there together in the murdering water. She heard Leander's voice from below, hoarse and cracking, calling and calling the boy's name into the wind. She heard the sea answer him, again and again, and never once the small, high voice she was straining for. The lantern light caught him once, only once, waist deep in the black surge and braced against a streaming rock, and her throat closed entirely, and she could not even pray. And then, a whole lifetime later, he was climbing. He came up the last of the cliff path on his knees, because his bad leg had failed him in the cold, with a soaked and frozen and blessedly living Perrin clamped fast against his chest inside his coat, and the little carved boat still gripped tight in the boy's white fist, because he had refused, even half drowned, to let the small thing go. They carried him in between them. They stripped the frozen clothes and wrapped him in every blanket the cottage owned, and built the fire up high and roaring, and Kara held her shivering son and did not weep, because weeping was a luxury for afterward. And just now, Perrin needed her warmth and her steadiness far more than her tears. By the deep middle of the night, the terrible shivering had eased at last into an exhausted, ordinary sleep, and the danger had passed. He would wake in the morning sore and proud and quite insufferable, with a tale to lord over every other child in the cove for a 12-month. It was only then, when the boy was truly safe, that the man himself came apart. Leander sat down upon the floor with his back against the wall, still soaked through, still shaking, and stared at nothing at all. And Kara crossed to him and knelt down in front of him and took his ruined hand up into both of her own, the first time in all those long years that she had willingly reached out and touched him, and she did not flinch from the wrongness of it, from the missing fingers and the cold, stiff claw the sea had made of it. And when he tried to draw it away from her in shame, she simply would not let him. "You went down into the sea," she said quietly. It meant to take another one from me. His voice was wrecked past mending. I have stood at the false grave of every soul I ever loved in this world. I was not going to go and stand at a true one, not for the sake of a wooden boat, not for anything under heaven. And then the Great Wall, that 6 years, and a French prison, and an ocean of grief had built in him came down all at once, and he wept. And this time, not in the silence a prison teaches. And Kara gathered the whole great shaking bulk of him against her, and held him the way she held her sons in the dark, and let him. He told her all of it then, the true and terrible whole of it, that he had spared her at the door. The men he had watched drown within reach of his own hand, while the cold sea held him back from them. The slow, patient murder of every hope in the cell at Verdun. And the worst of it, worse than all the rest, standing at her false grave with her own name freshly cut into the stone, believing it, and having, after that, nothing left in all the world to live toward. I carved them for 6 years for ghosts, he said into her shoulder. And tonight, I pulled a living boy up out of the sea with these same hands. I do not know what I have ever done to earn the right to hold anything real again. Kara took his face between her 2 hands and made him lift it and look at her. You are not holding a ghost, she said. You are here. We are all of us here, under this one small roof, the 4 of us, and every one of us alive. And because there were no walls left standing anywhere in the room, and not one reason left under heaven to build a new one, she leaned in and kissed him, once, softly. This man she had buried, and mourned, and hated, and grieved. And the kiss tasted of salt, and rain, and 6 wasted years. And underneath, faint and new, of something ahead of them that might, if only they were brave enough, prove worth the whole terrible price of the road that had brought them here. Outside, toward the gray of the dawn, the great storm at last blew itself out over the water. And inside the cottage, for the first time since the beginning of the whole long sorrow, they were no longer 2 frightened people guarding the very same secret from opposite sides of a locked door. They were 2 people standing, at last, on the same side of it. And whatever came up the cliff road to them now, it would find them there together, and waiting. Aldous Dacre came on the 9th day, in the middle of a still gray afternoon, in a black traveling carriage, with the arms of Ravensmore painted upon the door, arms he no longer had the smallest right to use. He did not come alone. Crail rode at the carriage's side upon a gray horse, and a second man rode behind, a thin, dry, black-clad figure with a fat leather case of papers, who could be nothing in this world but a lawyer. They came down the cliff road at a slow and stately walk, in no hurry whatever, and the whole of Carrick Cove stopped its work along the quay to watch them come. Kara stood in the open door of her cottage with Leander a half-step behind her shoulder, and her son safely out of sight in Jocelyn's stout keeping at the top of the village, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was not afraid. She had been afraid for 6 unbroken years. She had spent the last of it in the storm, holding a lantern over the black water. What was left in her now, with the fear all burned away, was something a great deal harder and clearer and colder. Aldous stepped down and cast his eye about him at the slate cottages and the drying nets and the silent, staring fishermen, with an expression of faint and fastidious distaste, as though the poverty might rub off and stain his boots. He was a handsome man, gone soft with good living, perhaps 10 years the elder of his cousin, and he wore the same gray Dacre eyes worn to a wholly different purpose. When his gaze found Leander, scarred and lean, and impossibly alive in the doorway of a fishwife's cottage, something flickered once across the smooth surface of his face, and was smoothed instantly away. "Cousin," he said, warm and pleasant, his voice carrying easily across the silent key. "You are looking remarkably well indeed, for a man 6 years drowned." "And you are looking remarkably calm," Leander answered, "for a man about to be named a forger in front of 40 witnesses." Aldous only smiled, as though at a small and clumsy joke. Strong words, unwise words, before so many ears. I have come a very great distance, out of nothing but family feeling, to see a painful matter settled quietly and kindly. He drew off his gloves one finger at a time, letting the silence work for him. "The matter is simple. You have suffered a terrible ordeal. 5 years in the hands of the French, half starved in the dark. Who could blame you if your poor, grieving mind had fastened upon some comforting fancy? A living wife, living children, a whole sweet family conjured out of the fever of a cell to keep a breaking man from going altogether mad." The gentleness of it was terrible to hear. It was the very same gentleness Crail had used upon a 6-year-old boy at the edge of the quay. "But the records, alas, are clear," Aldous went on, spreading his soft hands. "Written down, in ink, in the parish register, in the vicar's own hand. Cara Trewin, spinster, died in childbed 6 years ago, and her base-born infant with her, and there they lie beneath an honest stone that I myself paid to raise. There was no marriage, there are no lawful heirs, and this woman, this convenient fishwife with her 2 convenient sons, is no more than a common adventuress, sharp enough to see the main chance in a broken man and a great old name, and bold enough to reach out and take it. And there it was, laid bare in the cold, salt air. Not a knife in the dark, after all. Something worse, and a great deal cleverer. He did not need to harm a hair of the boys if he could prove, in a court of law, that they had never lawfully existed at all. He would drown them in ink instead of in seawater. He would take the very forgery he had committed with his own hand and hold it up as the proof of their unmaking, and dare any living soul to call the parish register a lie. The dry lawyer stepped forward at his master's nod and began to drone of affidavits, and of the burden of proof that lay in law upon the claimant, and of the very grave penalties awaiting any person of low estate who presumed to advance a false claim against a noble house. And Cara listened to the smooth machine of it, closing link by link around her children, and understood that against a duke's cousin and a practiced lawyer and a record in a vicar's own hand, the bare word of an unlettered fishwife and a scarred, half-mad, drowned man was worth, in the eyes of any court in England, precisely nothing at all. Aldous watched that understanding cross her face and smiled at her, almost with kindness. "You see it now," he said softly. "You are an intelligent woman. So, put your mark to the paper my man has drawn up, renouncing this sad fantasy. Take the very generous sum I am prepared to settle upon you. Go and live somewhere warm and quiet with your boys about you, and do not let the son of a shipwright break his heart, reaching for what was never his. It is the wisest thing you will ever do. Refuse me, and I will break you upon the wheel of a courtroom, and your 2 fine boys will grow to manhood as the base-born sons of a proven and public liar." The wind came in off the sea. Somewhere a loose halyard slapped against a mast, and into that waiting silence Leander spoke, very quietly, and it carried none the less to every ear upon the quay. "Open the box, Cara." Aldous' soft smile did not move, but something moved behind his eyes, and Crail upon his gray horse went suddenly very still. Cara turned and went back into the cottage. She knelt at the hearth and worked her fingers into the crack at the edge of the flat gray stone she had worked loose 100 times across 6 long years. The one stone she had checked was still in its place every single night before she let herself sleep. She lifted it out, and from the dry cavity beneath it, she drew up a small bundle wrapped close in oilcloth and carried it back out into the gray light, and unwrapped it there upon the flat top of the water butt, slowly, for all of them to see. "You are not the only one in this family who kept a record, Your Grace," she said, and laid his stolen title across him like the flat of a blade. "You forged a death. I kept a marriage. Let us set the two side by side and see which the law believes." And there, in the cold, salt wind off the Atlantic, one paper at a time, she laid them out. First the marriage lines themselves, the ink a little faded now, but the hand still clear, signed and dated and properly witnessed, in the careful copper plate of the Reverend Sylvan Penrith, who had joined them by license in a small stone chapel at Falmouth 7 years before. Beneath the vicar's name, the marks of the 2 witnesses who had stood up with them that day. And beneath those, side by side, in a young sea captain's bold black hand and a shipwright daughter's neat one, the 2 names, Leander Dacre and Cara Trewin, joined together in the sight of God and under the law of England, on a date more than a year before ever a child was born to either of them. Beside the lines, she laid a thick bundle of letters, folded soft with handling, everyone in Leander's unmistakable hand, and everyone addressed to my wife, and dated across the long weeks of his last fatal voyage out. And last of all, she laid a single sheet newer than the rest, and at the sight of it, the dry, black-clad lawyer went entirely and suddenly still. "And this," Cara said, resting one fingertip lightly upon it, "is the sworn statement of Mistress Enor Hendra, who served the Dowager Duchess of Ravensmore 40 years, taken down word for word from her own lips by the parson of her parish as she lay dying, not 3 weeks since, and signed with her own mark before 2 sound witnesses. In it, she swears, on the edge of her grave, that she was paid by Aldous Dacre to help enter a false death in the parish register at Falmouth, that she was paid again to stand by while a stone was raised over an empty grave, and that she herself, upon his direct instruction and against her own conscience, took a living girl and 2 living newborn boys and put them with her own hands onto a westbound coach, and was told and paid to forget forever that she had done it." Cara lifted her eyes and set them full upon Aldous. She could not forget. It was the not forgetting that killed her, in the end. But she signed her name to the whole truth of it before she went to her God, and here that truth was in the light of day. The silence upon the quay was total. Even the gulls had gone quiet, as though they too were waiting. The dry lawyer bent and picked up his fat leather case and set it down again behind him, very carefully, the way a man sets down a thing he has just discovered to be on fire in his hands. For the forgery of a parish register was no family matter to be smoothed away with a warm and quiet sum of coin. It was a felony. Conspiracy to defraud a noble house of its lawful succession was a second one laid atop the first, and what the dying mark of Enor Hendra described upon that single sheet, the taking of money for the removal of 2 living heirs, brushed close enough against a third and far darker crime that no lawyer drawing breath would stand within 10 feet of the man who had commissioned it, not for any fee the whole estate could offer. "I find that I no longer represent this gentleman," the dry lawyer said, to nobody in particular, and took up his case and stepped well back. Aldous Dacre stood alone in the wind, his soft, handsome face gone the gray-white color of old ash, and Kara watched the whole vast edifice of 6 patient years collapse, silently, behind his eyes. He had built his lie in ink and in stone, precisely because ink and stone endured, because they could not be burned or drowned or made to change their story. And now, that same iron permanence had turned in his soft hand and cut him open to the bone with his own blade. The forged death did not unmake the marriage. It only unmasked the forger. The empty grave did not bury the heirs. It had only, all along, been quietly digging his own. "You have no true witnesses," Aldous tried, but the gentleness had drained clean out of him, and his voice found nothing left to stand upon. The deathbed raving of a senile servant, the clever forgeries of a scheming fishwife. I am a Dacre of Ravensmoor. I will be believed over such as these. You are a Dacre of Ravensmoor, who has just been named a forger, aloud, before 40 fishermen, his own lawyer, and the rightful duke, Leander said. And he stepped down at last from the doorway, and though he limped upon his ruined leg, and though he held his ruined hand curled against his chest, he had never once in his life looked more entirely the master of a great and ancient house. So hear now what will happen, cousin, for I will say it only once. You will get back into that carriage, which is mine. You will drive to Ravensmoor, which is mine, and you will remove yourself, and every debt you have heaped upon my lands in the 6 years you spent playing at being me, before ever I set my own foot across its threshold again. And then you will go, and live small, and live quiet. And every morning God grants you, for the whole remainder of your small and forfeit life, you will pray that I have decided the ruin of your name is punishment enough, because the other choice is mine now. It is mine, and I hold it. The choice to lay Enor Hendra's statement before the king's bench, and to stand in the gallery, and to watch them hang you for it. I will hold that over your head for exactly as long as you live quietly beneath it. And the first morning that you do not, I will let it fall. For a long moment Aldous Dacre looked at the two of them standing together in the cottage door, and at the little row of damning papers fluttering beneath Kara's steady hand, and at the silent, unmoving wall of fishermen who had drawn in close and closed around this one woman like the gray sea over a stone. And then, without a further word, because there were none left in him that would not only make the ruin worse, he turned upon his heel and climbed back into the black carriage that was not his, and it turned in the narrow lane and went back up the cliff road the way it had come, smaller and smaller against the low gray sky, until it went over the brow of the hill and was gone. Crail, upon his gray horse, lingered a moment longer than his master. He looked down the quay at Kara and at the papers, and touched the brim of his hat to her, once, gravely, and there was in his soft and clever face something that looked very nearly like respect. I did try to tell him, Crail remarked, to no one at all, gathering up his reins. Twins are a rare thing. And he wheeled the gray horse about, and rode away up the road after his ruined master, and did not once look back. And Kara stood in the sudden vast quiet of the emptied quay, with the marriage lines fluttering softly under the flat of her hand, and the wind coming clean and cold off the water. And Leander's good arm came around her shoulders and drew her in against his side. And at the top of the village, a door was flung open, and 2 small brown boys came tearing headlong down the lane toward their mother and the tall man who was theirs, shouting into the wind, wholly and gloriously alive, and, for the first morning in the whole of their lives, entirely unafraid. They were not married in a cathedral, for the simple reason that they were already married, and had been for 7 years, and Kara flatly refused to let the world pretend otherwise for the sake of a spectacle. But on a bright, still morning, a month later, When the storms had gone out of the sky, and the sea lay flat and silver all the way to France, they stood together in the small stone chapel at the head of Carrick Cove, and had the Reverend Penrith, who had married them once already, and was overjoyed to find them both alive, bless the union again before the only witnesses that mattered. The whole of the cove came. Ferdy wept into his cap. Jocelyn brought cider. Perrin and Jory, scrubbed and outraged at the scrubbing, carried the ring between them on a cushion, and very nearly came to blows over whose turn it was to hold it. Leander did not sweep them away to Ravensmoor. That was the thing Cara had braced for, and the thing he did not do. He did not arrive as a duke and gather up his lost family like luggage and carry them off to a great cold house full of strangers. Instead, on the night after the blessing, he sat with her by the fire and said, in the careful voice of a man who has learned the hard way not to assume, "I have a house. It is large, and it is grand, and it is, at present, entirely without joy. I would like to fill it with you and the boys, but I have missed 6 years of their lives that I can never have back, and I will not begin the years I have left by deciding anything for you the way everyone has always decided everything for you. So I am asking, not telling, what do you want, Cara?" And Cara, who had not been asked what she wanted by any living soul in the whole of her adult life, found she had to sit with the question a while before she could answer it. In the end, they did not choose one life over the other. They chose both. The boys would grow up knowing they were the sons of the Duke of Ravensmoor, with all the armor that name would give them, and they would take their place in that great house and learn its weight. But the cottage at Carrick Cove would stay theirs, always, and every summer the whole family would come back to the cove that had hidden a frightened woman and her children, and asked nothing, and lied for them, and held them, and the boys would run wild on the shingle, where their father had once gone into the Black Sea to save one of them, and they would sail their little carved boats on calm water. The news reached London in its own good time, and when it came, it was not a scandal, but a wonder. The gossips did not know what to do with it. The vanished shipwright's daughter, the fishwife at the end of the world, had turned out to be a duchess after all, and her 2 brown, loud fisher boys, the legitimate heirs to one of the oldest names in England. Aldous Dacre was not spoken of, which was its own kind of verdict. He had gone abroad, it was said, for his health, and would not be returning, and the estate he had bled for 6 years was slowly, under a careful new hand, being brought back to life. Some said the new duchess kept the ledgers herself. Those who said it did not say it as a criticism. They had seen what she did to men who cheated at sums. On the last evening of that first summer, Cara stood in the door of the cottage at Carrick Cove and watched her husband and her sons down on the shingle in the long gold light. Leander was on his knees in the sand, his ruined hand steadying a little wooden hull, while Perrin argued fiercely about the set of the sail, and Jory launched his own boat into the shallows with a shriek of joy. The sea that had taken so much lay quiet at their feet now, giving nothing back and taking nothing away, just water in the evening light. She thought of the girl in the Falmouth shipyard who had argued with a captain over the price of timber. She thought of the young widow with everything she owned, knotted into a shawl, and 2 infants, and no name. She thought of 6 years of watching the cliff road every single evening for the thing she feared, and how, in the end, the thing that had come up that road in the rain had not been her ruin at all. It had been the beginning of the only real safety she had ever known. Some secrets are shelters, but a shelter is a thing you live in only until you no longer need to hide. Cara Dacre Duchess of Ravensmore, stood in her doorway in the last of the light and watched the three people she loved most in all the world play at the edge of a calm sea. And she did not watch the road behind them even once.